Well, thank you, General Sullivan, and thank you all for being here this morning. This is my first time to be at this event, although I have followed it from afar. And there are many thanks to give out to folks here who have been a great influence to me already in my just 2 years serving in the United States Army. And General Sullivan kindly recognized many of them. Let me thank again, though, Mr. Brandt, thank you for sponsoring this breakfast. General Craddock, it was an honor to sit next to you and to learn more about your distinguished career as well. I know we have around here many folks I work with. General Spohr, of course, who spoke at this very podium just a few weeks ago, works closely with me in my job as the Chief Management Officer of the Army. And I know he spoke about business transformation, something I will briefly touch on as well. And there are many other great distinguished civilian workers who do such heroic things for the Army here today. I know we have a number of active duty folks who I see around the Pentagon, a number of retirees, and many folks who out in the business sector are providing able support to our Army today as well. So thank you all for letting me be a small part of your morning. I have now been on the job for 60 days, and I hope because my tenure has been so brief, you will indulge me a bit. I had prepared remarks, but last night as I left a dinner party, I thought I would forego those remarks and instead speak a bit extemporaneously and talk about some of the things that I think about as the Undersecretary of the Army. And I won't offer today many answers to you about kind of what I think the future of the Army is going to be, or offer you even great optimism that all of these problems can be solved. Instead, I thought I might just enumerate a few of the questions that animate me as now a senior leader of the Army, and in so doing perhaps give you some insight into kind of the way I think, and perhaps the way that Secretary McHugh does as well. And I would be remiss in not mentioning Secretary McHugh, who does such a terrific job leading the Army. I had the chance to serve with him in Congress. He was of the opposite party to me, much older than I was, in a very hierarchical institution. So we didn't know each other well. But it has been a great honor for me to serve with him in the United States Army, where his decision-making on a day-to-day basis, faced with some of the most controversial questions that one can imagine, is always impeccable. And the same thing can be said about our Chief of Staff, General Odierno, who is confronted with an extraordinarily challenging time as we come out of OIF and OEF, as the budget draws down. He too does an extraordinary job leading our Army, and so we are so very lucky to have people like that. So as I mentioned, I want today to talk not so much to you as to talk with you, and to eschew the kind of standard oratorical fare in the hopes of, again, posing some questions to you that I think are going to be the most important ones facing the Army over the next 2, 5, perhaps even 10 years. It's worth setting the scene, though, about the context, if you will, from which these questions arise. Now, this context is one well known to the people in this room, but it is a context worth repeating again because the facts and the figures are increasingly harrowing. The Army budget this year is about $120 billion. We will get $20 to $25 billion more in the so-called Overseas Contingency Operations Funds. So a total budget of a little less than $150 billion. I'm sure Joe Martz can give me the exact and precise figure if he were up here advising me. That, of course, is a far cry from what it was just a few years ago when the overall Army budget peaked in 2008, a year when the OCO budget was actually larger than the base budget reaching its acme in 2010 at a little more than $140 billion. At our height, we had 570,000 people in the Army. Today, we still have, as we speak, more than 500,000 people in the Army, about 503,000 to be exact, on our way down to numbers far less than that, 490,000, 450,000. And if sequestration continues to work its sinister effect on the Army, we will be down to 420,000, and perhaps great pressure to go to numbers still far below that. We have an active component that has tremendous combat experience. We have about 40 brigade combat teams, kind of the hallmark fighting units for the Army, 28 in the National Guard. We have a National Guard that is more than 350,000 people today, a Army Reserve Compo 3 that has a little less than 200,000 people, about 5,000 people less than it is authorized to do. And as the Army goes down to, say, 420,000, that reserve component will draw down commensurately, with a Guard going down to perhaps as low as 315,000 and the Army Reserve going down to 185,000. So there are big changes before us in how we manage these changes, both in the drawdown of officers. Just this week, we announced the separation of more than 1,000 captains. These kind of involuntary separations are painful to everyone. And as the Chief reminded the U.S. Senate just this week at the Senate caucus breakfast, there are real costs, human costs, to the drawdown that the budget situation is imposing upon us. We've, of course, been here before, and for those of you, and there are many in this room who have decades of experience in the U.S. Army, said you have seen crises like this before. Just here at the head table where I was sitting, we have people who have lived and worked these issues before. So I say I wanted to offer a few questions without offering you definitive answers. I do so in the spirit of a very wise man who once said that in the Army, and perhaps in all things, the intellectual must lead the physical. And General Sullivan, when you got to those words many years ago, they were very true, and they remain true today. So let me talk about some of these questions, things that I think about, and that I think the Army should think about as well. The first of these questions is one that I would pose to the Department of Defense. And this is the only question I would offer today that goes to the larger entity than simply the U.S. Army. I'll offer you 10 more that I offer just to the U.S. Army, and then I'll offer a rhetorical one to conclude. This first question is whether this process that so drives the institutional Army, the planning, programming, budget, and execution system, is still the right system for defense planning in this country. Now, you know, I'm amazed as a politician, as someone who once taught business school, which is what I was doing before I immediately came to the Army a couple of years ago, that Robert McNamara will go down perhaps as the greatest bureaucrat since Alexander Hamilton in his influence. Today, we still, in the Department of Defense, live underneath his shadow. And when he put in the PPBE process more than 50 years ago now, he made decisions about force structure that lasted throughout the Cold War. This process, now entrenched, now capitalized throughout the entire building, so it has worked well in some ways, but I think it is a question worth considering whether it is still the optimal planning system for an age of uncertainty, where we have to go forward, not clear who the exact threats might be, the need to be more agile, the need to be more flexible in our planning. Said the PPBE system may not be optimized to do that. It may not be optimized in a world now where the combatant commanders, something that he didn't have to think as much about, but are the driving force within the Department of Defense. So we now seemingly have an odd system where combatant commanders, who are the consumers of what we provide as a military service, have no real say in the supply of things offered to them. They have indirect say, that is true, so I'm being a bit hyperbolic, but nonetheless we are providing services to customers who don't have a direct input on what the various departments are providing to them. That would seem to be a misalignment of incentives in a way that calls into question the continued vitality of a planning system that has worked well, but is now, again, more than half a century old. Even back in the 1960s, when Charles Hitch was the comptroller of the Department of Defense, he recognized some of these weaknesses, particularly the one I just mentioned, and offered solutions to it, but wasn't able to get any traction. But these are questions, right, that are as vital today as they were back then, if not more so. So turning to the United States Army. You know, when I was in Congress, I wrestled with a question, and I wrestled with it often, actually, as the General Counsel and as the Undersecretary of the Army, too. When someone on the street, someone perhaps even well-tutored in defense issues, asks me, how do you think about the optimal size for the United States Army? What should it be? How do you even go about approaching a question like that? Well, when I was in Congress, I could never really do so. What's the difference in 450 versus 440,000 troops versus 500,000 troops? Or perhaps, as Admiral Roughead recently wrote, 280,000 troops, his desired end state for the active component in the Army. What's the difference? I mean, how does one go about even thinking about this kind of question? And why do so many people seem to have a very different view about what the ideal size of the U.S. Army is versus what probably most of us in this room think, and certainly the institutional Army might think it to be. Well, I thought a lot about that, about where the communication breaks down. And I think it comes down to this. It's an age-old question, too, much like this PPBE matter. But it's the first question I would offer you today, and that is, are we going to size the U.S. Army based on needed capabilities or on assessed threats? Now, this is, again, an older question. Throughout the Cold War, we basically had a threat-based construct. We had a clearly identifiable threat with known capabilities. We could plan to it. We knew what our allies could bring. It dominated across the .mil-PF of what we were trying to do. We still talked about capabilities when you had Bob McNamara, who I've already cited, discussing the need for the ability to fight 2.5 wars. And after the Cold War ended, of course, and that obvious threat receded, we moved to more emphasis on those capabilities with 2 wars or 1.5 wars, or now we're at 1.25 wars, or a war and an air war, or however the construct is today. But this notion of needing to have capabilities even if you really weren't quite sure what the threats were. Now, those threats never truly disappeared because it's important to have scenarios by which one tests your capabilities, kind of imaginary situations out there that you might have to fight in. But capabilities dominated kind of the post-Cold War era. But it seems to me that in this age of budget austerity, we are increasingly back to threat-based planning, where if the Army cannot tie its force structure to an identifiable threat in Asia or the Middle East, or perhaps we now see in Europe as well, it's difficult to justify its size. Now, these are philosophical questions, about how one should think about what to size the U.S. Army. And for most of us in the Army, we believe that even if there wasn't an obvious threat from which we would need a 1 million man and woman Army across the AC and the RC, a superpower like ours, faced with strategic surprise, things we never anticipate never can quite anticipate, should have the ability to do certain things, Again, not tethered to a particular scenario, although scenarios can test us, but that we should have certain abilities, to do things, a capability-based approach. This is seemingly a somewhat disfavored view now, although never articulated in perhaps as clear a way as I have offered here. But this is a major question to the Army that we must grapple with, is are we going to be a threat-based structure or a capabilities-based structure? I will go over these other questions perhaps more briefly, but the second one goes to the heart of the work I do, which is what is the ideal size of the generating force? A force that has varied from 80 to 110,000 people over the last 15 years. That generating force, of course, being the people charged with manning and training and equipping our operators. What is the right size of that force? We don't model it with the same fidelity we do the operating force. We take guesses at it more. We think we have it right. But what is the right size for that? And a third question related to it is, how does that generating force size vary with the size of the operating force? We know it's not perfectly linear. If we draw down the operating force by 10%, the generating force doesn't necessarily fall by 10%. There is some floor below which, even if we only had, God forbid, 100,000 operators, you would still need an operating force of 50 or 100,000, perhaps 2, just to man, train, and equip the Army and prepare for the day when, again, that strategic surprise arises and we have to increase it rapidly. Increasing it rapidly leads to that fourth question. A fourth question that we must grapple with and that we must convince our interlocutors at the Office of the Secretary of Defense to think about too, which is how fast can the Army grow? Now, we're moving to a world where, as the Chief often says, the Army will be at its lowest size since before World War II, where we had 280,000 people, 14,500 officers at that time. Now, in just the space of 6 years, we grew to 90 divisions and more than 8 million people in the U.S. Army, an extraordinary achievement. But we did it under very different circumstances. An existential threat to the nation, conscription, which had minimal political opposition. One can grow the Army rapidly when a true crisis arises. But short of that, it is very, very difficult to do so. Between 2000 and 2011, including those years when we had all kinds of incentives in place trying to grow the Army, admittedly in a war environment that was not always the easiest to recruit in. The most the enlisted force ever grew in a single year was 9%. If we were to try to grow our Army from 420,000, as we are moving to, if not lower, to, say, back to 550 or 570,000, we would have to grow our force by 35 to 40% in accessions each year. Accessions, I mentioned, grew by 9% at their height, not just the overall force. Accessions never increased year over year by more than 9%, but we would have to grow in accessions by probably 35 or 40% per year. Now, that is probably not possible no matter what kind of financial incentives one puts in place. But to even try to do that, right, is an extraordinarily costly thing. Costly not only in terms of the special pay and benefits that we might have to offer, but costly too in the fact that, as we saw during the Grow the Army era, standards will have to be relaxed. People like me can get into the U.S. Navy, for example, long past the age that one should normally be joining the United States Navy. But more than that, right, during that period, and I saw this often when I was general counsel, right, people were coming into the Army who were from a lower quintile in the AFQT distribution. Perhaps they were getting waivers because they had been involved in petty criminal behavior as a young man or woman. Their fitness wasn't what it was. Perhaps they had medical conditions for which they had to have waivers. We will deal with these things on the back end. And sometimes people come into the services who aren't equipped for the rigors of combat. And to them, said, the consequences of seeing things in the front lines, said, are even more devastating than they would be to people perhaps who come in with greater physical and mental fitness. And for those people, we rightfully take care of them, but we will take care of them for decades and decades to come. Some of you may have seen the recent article in the Wall Street Journal that we are still paying benefits to a single woman from the Civil War. Now, given the fact that people are living longer and longer, it is not unimaginable, in fact, it is entirely predictable, that we will be paying benefits to survivors of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts until the middle of the next century. So that's an amazing thing, and the consequence will be billions and billions and billions of dollars to go. The fifth question I would offer to you quickly is, how do you plan for the regeneration of the U.S. Army? If we're going to go down to 420,000, or God forbid lower than that, how do you build it back up, right? How do you quickly move back, not only to recruit the right people, to make sure you have the units, the field grade officers, the senior NCOs who can take leadership roles in there? Not an easy question either. The RAND Corporation recently did an analysis on this very question, and they tentatively estimated that what the Army should do is keep about 15,000 officers or senior NCOs in the generating force and leave them there, parked, if you will, in case a crisis breaks out, and they can be the nucleus for regrowing the Army. Now, this seems like a perfectly plausible, indeed very good idea, but it isn't easy to do. Because when you keep those folks in the Army and you're limited in the number of troops you can have, right, cuts have to be made elsewhere. And of course, senior NCOs and field grade officers are more expensive than other perhaps younger officers or young soldiers, and therefore your grade plate gets out of whack, and when your budget is under pressure, right, this becomes more expensive too. So our even ability to do that challenges the way we do business. A sixth question I would offer to you, and this is an important one that the current Chief of Staff is grappling with, along with Dave Perkins down at Training and Doctrine Command, is whether the Army's concepts of operations are adequate to a world where precision-guided munitions are proliferating, to a world where the price of computing power, sensors, weaponry is going down relative to the cost of the means to protect against them, whether it's better armor, stealth, hypersonic speed. Whether our operating concepts are adapted to a world where our adversaries scrupulously avoid ever crossing a red line. that they know would invoke American military response, but instead rely upon lawfare, information operations, or proxies to achieve their goals. Are we ready for that kind of world? A seventh question is, what's the proper role of the reserve component? Not only the National Guard, of course, which has been much in the news, but also the United States Army Reserve. Should the Guard be operational or strategic? Should all of the combat effects that are in the reserve components be in the National Guard and not in the U.S. Army Reserve as well? An Army Reserve which is filled with technical enablers of the First Order, but lacks really combat power. Or should those roles be shared in some way between the two components? An eighth question deals with modernization. Should we focus on resetting the vast property book of the Army? Or should we be thinking about next generation investments? And how do you balance these kinds of things? You know, Ray Mason, who I'm sure has been here on many occasions, does a terrific job on these issues. And the Army property book, which I'm sure doesn't capture everything we own, is now at more than $250 billion. We have a lot of gear out there, right? It is expensive to sustain it. It's expensive to recapitalize it as it comes out of theater. Some of it may not even be needed for the kind of wars we think we have to fight in the future. So how do we balance these kind of priorities? A ninth question for you is whether R4Gen, that readiness model adopted in the wake of OIF and OEF, and has proved so successful to us, but comes at a high price, whether that's the right model of readiness for the future. I'm sure General Huggins, who sits over here, has dedicated people who think nothing about this very question of whether R4Gen is right, or is there a return to tiered readiness, or perhaps some hybrid model is the best for the future. But this is a very important and will be a major change for the U.S. Army and a challenge we confront. And a 10th question, and perhaps somewhat controversial, but one that's of great interest to me, is whether our emphasis on decisive action training is adequate to prepare for the range of military operations the United States is going to face over the next 10, 20, or 30 years. These are the kind of things that TRADOC is working about, and that when the chief who has chartered the Force 2025 and beyond effort is looking at too. What does the Army need to train to, and how do we deal with it? So these are the 10 questions that I often think about, one posed OSD in addition. And let me end with a rhetorical question, which is something that is incumbent upon me, but those of you in this room who care about the Army too, to also think about, is can we explain ourselves to the American public, to the U.S. Congress, and to the Office of the Secretary of Defense in a way that they can understand the things that most of you have lived and understand so well? I'll give you just one example from an anecdote that occurred at the dinner party I was attending last night, which involved a discussion about a major figure who formerly worked in the OSD policy, who had a big hand, right, in all these national strategic documents that have rolled out, most of which, well, they don't treat the Army in the way that most of us in this room think the Army should have been treated. So there was discussion about how much combat power, say, a 500,000 person active component Army would really bring. 500,000 people seems like a lot of folks after all, right, to a lay person at least, even lay people who, again, spend lots of time in the national security space. So he said, you know, 500,000 people would seem to be adequate for nearly every kind of imaginable problem that this country might faces. But of course, one has to get into those numbers and explain them in a way that this person, so involved in national strategic issues, in national security policy making, had no idea. He had no idea that, yes, we might have 500,000 people, but 80,000 of them are trainees, transients, holdees, and students, and therefore they can't fight. That we have a generating force of 80 to 100,000 people who are necessary to man, train, and equip those people who might fight. That we have 20 or 30,000 people who are doing national missions like theater missile defense or security cooperation, who, sure, they could be pulled out perhaps and sent elsewhere, but said the National Command Authority thinks they're very important. So yes, you're left with maybe out of that 500,000 person force, about 300,000 or 325,000 who could be deployed somewhere. But of course, Congress itself, this isn't simply an Army preference, doesn't want to send you over there to stay till you win it, right? We want to rotate you out, and we have good reason for rotating you out. So yes, even if you want to go on, say, a 1-to-1 bog-dwell ratio, boots on ground to time in theater, right? You're talking about 150,000 people who can go at any one moment. And Congress would like to have a longer bog-dwell ratio than that. And pretty soon, you're much, much smaller in the number of people who can actually go and fight at any given moment. Right? This was surprisingly news to this major figure, right? That a 500,000 force, when you're providing not only combat power, but the entire substrata of American military power, which is what the U.S. Army does, right? We don't just fight. We bring the dogs and the mortuary affairs and the cooks and the cleaners and everyone else in between that allow the other services to do their job. Right? When you put all of these kinds of things together, right, that the Army has to have a certain size just to do its job. And that size is larger than even very smart people might think it should be. Now, I don't begrudge this person for not knowing that, because it's our job to explain it to him. And when he doesn't understand it, it means that people like me have failed in our job. So I conclude with that rhetorical question to say we must do a better job of explaining ourselves to the people who love this country, love the military, who love the U.S. Army too, but sometimes don't understand that this is the world's most complicated organization. And the way we run it is often opaque, even to its most senior leaders. And we have to be better at explaining to the people who own the Army, the American public and their representatives, right, what we do and our vision for the future. And we must be better. We've done it well, but we haven't done it well enough. So thank you for letting me come say a few words to you today. I'm sure you have a few questions as well for me, and I am grateful to General Sullivan for extending the opportunity. Army strong.
John Brandt from Western Line Defense. Perhaps an 11th question that you could add to your repertoire. And while it's I think inherent in recapitalization and modernization, et cetera, is the question of how does a healthy industrial base tie into all of the things that you're talking about?
I could have easily added that as a priority of ours, right? A healthy industrial base is critical, and it's hard to maintain that when you have these cuts in the Army procurement accounts, for example. But that's a vital national asset, of which I hope is the Undersecretary to be able to help work with. And I think it's underappreciated. It's, again, one of those issues that even people who care a lot about national security don't understand how vital that industrial base is and the threat that sequestration, the budget cuts are posing to that. So it plays a critical role. And I think across the Department of Defense, people give lip service to that, but oftentimes don't devote the resources or have a coherent strategy to do that. So hopefully I can help with that.
Roger Thompson with AUSA. We talk in the association about some of the things that you've talked about in some detail. One of the things that has become more public more recently is testimony on Capitol Hill in which senior leaders of both the entire United States military as well as the Army have talked about risk and the concept of risk. Obviously, there are lots of ways to define it and discuss it, but operational risk, strategic risk, risk of being viable in these capabilities and missions. Can you comment about how the concept of risk and the implications fit into what you've just talked about, please?
Yes, absolutely. Risk, I think, is the word I hear most commonly, right, from the Army these days. Basically, everything we do, we can't do what we would really aspire to do. And we define that gap as being risk. So, I often ask this question. In fact, I have Colonel Paul Pelozzi, who runs my Strategic Initiatives Group, is in the back here. I actually have a task for them. I said, I'd like you to write for me a history of how we use the term risk across the Department of Defense, because we use it so much. I said, it's a great interest to me what that phrase really means and how it has made its way into our doctrine and concepts and things like that. But for me, I think, right, I use risk in this common way, that when there is a gap between our ends, ways, and means, right, we have a risk of some kind. Now, how you quantify risk between high and moderate, right, is professional military judgment in many ways, right? So when the chief says this is moderate risk, he is using his more than 30 years of experience to say that this is what it is. I'll tell you the way I approach it, which is a little bit differently perhaps. I think it is a way of explaining things to policymakers. right? I never tell people in discussing these kind of questions, right, that failure will ensue from any decision they reach for us, right? If we don't have enough training days for our people, right, we will still prevail in the conflict because we have the world's best army, right? We will win at a certain cost that one doesn't really know for sure, right? But people who spend their lives thinking about these issues think will be more costly financially and in blood of our young men and women, and perhaps strategic objectives will be harder to obtain over time, but right, we will prevail in the end. And to lay out for them the choices they have, you know, for example, if they want to have a 400,000 person U.S. Army, right, the Army will still be a formidable force. There will be no Army that can compete with us. But if you want us to fight around the world, it will be hard to do so, right? The bog-to-well ratios will be impossible to maintain. We'll have to use the reserve component in very strenuous ways. We know on the back end, if you want to do all of these levers, right, that we have family breakdowns and divorces and kind of social problems that arise when you keep people apart for years at a time from their loved ones, right? These are all things that are levers that people can pull, right? And, you know, if all hell broke loose tomorrow, we would pull those levers, right, in some way. So that's what I tried to explain myself in using the term risk, right? Policymakers are the people who should be taking risk. We need to tell them, frankly, kind of like, here's what you can do. Here's how you would mitigate those kind of things. And, you know, there are many competing priorities in this country, right? Things besides the U.S. Army, right? There are tax cuts, there's social services, there is the U.S. Navy and the Air Force and the Pacific Pivot, in which they're playing a key role. Right, we elect people and put great responsibility on them to balance these kinds of risks. And so what I try to do in talking to them is to say, like, here's what the real risk is. And, you know, it's grave in our mind, but maybe you have countervailing concerns that are still more pressing to you, right, that you should be aware of. And therefore, you can make the right decision about it. So, you know, we use risk a lot, and it's a term we love to use because there are lots of things that are at risk in the U.S. Army today. I think in part of our communication strategy, right, we need to try to be better about explaining exactly what that risk is to people, how you try to quantify it in some way, or at least offer a qualitative discussion of it, and then, you know, kind of ways that it could be mitigated, right, what the consequences are. Because I think when people say risk, people think like, well, failure is going to ensue. Well, it's unlikely that failure is going to ensue, right? It's just costly, right, in real cost to people. And therefore it gives us more credibility in discussing kind of what the courses of action for them might be. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Franklin Childers from the Army Reserve. You alluded to the fact that we're downsizing a lot of our captains and majors, and NCOs. We view those people as a valuable resource in the nation. How do we communicate to those people how valuable their service has been and encourage them to continue to serve in the Army Reserve and the National Guard?
Well, we hope that they will do that. As I mentioned, we are separating about more than 1,000 captains that was just announced this week. Right, the authorizations in the U.S. Army Reserve are 205,000. You have about 198,000 people in the Army Reserve today. And that was an intention, right, of the Army Reserve from a few years ago to try to have some slack in there where some of these fine officers could join them. And the truth is, many of the folks we're separating are very fine officers, very fine enlisted soldiers as well, people who have combat experience, some of them decorated for their combat experience. And so getting them into the Guard, into the USAR is a priority of ours. And we're trying to communicate that with them. Right, we need to work and still some things, right, where people can transfer MOSs, as an example, right, if there are higher demands in the U.S. Army Reserve than perhaps for a particular MOS, and trying to do those kind of transitions. But that's an important thing for us, right, because, you know, the people we're separating are great Americans, and finding a way for them to continue to serve, as most of them want to do, in the Guard and the Reserve is going to be a very important part of that. So something that we can communicate from the highest levels, like from me, and also make sure we have programs in place, right, that make that transition a seamless one for them. Again, changing their occupations if needed to do that as well. But
good morning, sir. I'm David Fastben, currently of Excellus, but formerly Damo SS on the Army staff. I wish I had you helping me write the ASPG a few years ago, because if the Army could take your 10 questions and answer them, it would be probably the best strategic planning guidance we ever published. One of your questions was particularly interesting to me, and the one about the R4Gen model, because depending on the answer to that question, your math, which was spot on, changes dramatically. If you don't have a rotating force, the argument for force structure changes completely. So can you give us any ideas of how that debate is going and how that question might be answered?
General Huggins could probably give you a more definitive answer because it's back in your old shop and places like that, right, where these things are really being worked on. I would say it hasn't percolated up to my level other than this question of, right, hey, is this the right model for us? And people understand that we need to look at alternatives to it. But there's been no discussion among the Secretary or me, and I don't know among the Secretary and the Chief about what are really viable alternatives to us, right? Going back to a tiered readiness system, right, is not something that people openly aspire to. That is seen as kind of, tiered readiness is not a term with positive connotations throughout the U.S. Army today for lots of reasons. And so, the question is, what are the alternatives to that, right? What are the real costs to that? So I know that there are lots of folks who work for General Huggins, right, who are thinking deeply and working on alternatives for us. But I think we're still a ways away from moving to a system other than R4Gen. So, because it said it's, well, you know the Army well, right? There's an inertia that it takes a lot of thinking. I mean, it's an important issue, right? These readiness models are, and how we do it is something you don't take lightly. So it's working its way through the system, but I think we're still a ways away from announcing any kind of changes on that. So.
Thank you very much, sir. Let's have a round of applause.
Thank you all.
Secretary.